So they won't run out of people, but this clearly is going to have a long-term impact on Ukraine's future and their ability to rebuild. I think, though, if the United States and UK would say Ukraine not only can win, Ukraine will win, and we want them to win. That's our stated objective, which is missing now, is for them to win. Then, if that happens, then all the excuses about why we haven't provided certain things, those fall away, and this thing will end this year. So there are 2 or 3 factors that are out there, I think, that impact this. Obviously, President Xi is in Russia now for his visit, and the Chinese would like to be in the position of helping to bring about a peaceful settlement and that sort of thing. And I think the Russians would love to have some kind of a settlement where they don't lose anything that they already have. This would be a disaster for Ukraine, and it would be terrible for all the rest of us to see Russia be rewarded for any of its aggressive behavior. And Crimea, of course, which is the thing that gets batted around as possible. Come on, let them have Crimea so we can stop this. That's a guarantee that Ukraine will never rebuild its economy, and that it's the launching pad for Russia to resume things in 2 or 3 years when they're ready. So that's out there in the near term. But to the point of your question about American domestic politics, the burden is on my president to explain why this matters. And I think, actually, what I saw at the Munich Security Conference back in February, where the largest U.S. congressional delegation ever to attend the Munich Security Conference was there, including a large number of Republicans, led by the Republican Senate Minority Leader, Mitch McConnell. And Mr. McConnell stood up at an event and said, I am here, along with almost all of the Senate Republican leadership and many leaders from the House, to say that we are here to support Ukraine, to support Europe, to support NATO. And of course, and then he went on Fox TV and said the same thing that night and said, look, and what he's trying to do is separate the core of the leadership of the Republican Party from the extremist voices that are out there that are making ridiculous comments like, this is a regional border dispute or something like that. So that gives me confidence. And the fact that the Congress has continued to support Ukraine in a very strong bipartisan way. I mean, all of this aid would not be happening if it was just Democrats pushing for it. So I've seen enough commentary and evidence of strong Republican support for this that I am not so worried that next year, by the end of 2024, when there's another election, that this will dry up. But again, the burden is on the current administration to explain why this is in America's interest. Exactly what Senator McConnell said. This is in America's interest, that Europe is stable, secure, and prosperous because our prosperity is tied to it. That the so-called international rules-based order, which means sovereignty of borders, every Republican cares about sovereignty of borders, free trade, freedom of navigation, which is part of trade in America, depends on trade. And in all these other aspects of things, that's our interest. And then, of course, the fact that the Chinese are watching to see, can we get this done? Can we stick together? And so Republicans say we need to be focused on the Chinese. This is about China. This is all about the strategic outcome that we want. If the president says we want Ukraine to win, we want them to win, then all of these excuses about how long it'll take to train, or this tank burns too much fuel, or there's so many excuses have been deployed to explain why we're not doing exactly what you just described, because we haven't said we want to win. The administration, despite the amazing job they've done on so much of this, still continues to self-deter because of, I think, an exaggerated concern about Russia somehow is going to pull out some sort of way to escalate that we haven't anticipated, or that they would actually use a nuclear weapon of some sort. And I think the administration has got to get over that. they're not going to use a nuclear weapon. But even if they did use a tactical nuclear weapon, the administration would have to follow through on what they said, catastrophic consequences. And as I said earlier, we used to train to operate in an environment where the Soviets used lots of tactical nuclear weapons. This is not, Dr. Strangelove or Hiroshima type.
That the policy was regime change, that we wanted to put in sanctions and create political pressures to bring down Vladimir Putin. It tells you two things. One, there is a very strong anti-Putin animus existent in the U.S. government. And two, there's a level of ignorance about Russia that is mind-boggling. I'm not going to brag, but back in December, I said, if we implement these sanctions, Russia will emerge stronger, intact, and it will be the Western economies that begin to collapse. I was proven 100% correct. Why? Because I have taken the time to study Russia, and understand the realities of their economy. But to do that, I have to cut through the fiction that's been put up there about, for instance, that Russia is a nation ruled by one man, Vladimir Putin, the all-seeing, all-knowing, all-evil dictator who controls everything, instead of recognizing the reality that Russia is a very large country where control has been delegated to regional authorities who manage their individual regions, who come together using a bureaucracy to create a consolidated, unified policy that's then taken up to Putin, who oversees it, as a manager, as the chief executive, but not as a dictator. If you understand what I say is the reality, then you're able then to take the time to read the position papers that are put out there. The Russians are telling us what they're doing. They don't lie. They are a very transparent society. Their budget is published. The documents that are used to create that budget are published, and people need to take the time to read that. But if you do that, then it takes away your ability to say, well, Vladimir Putin is the personification of evil. Because if you take the time to study Russia and learn Russia, you realize he's just a very effective manager of a very complex and expansive, nation. Joe Biden is surrounded by what I call the Putin whispers. This is a group of people who came into academic maturity at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the decade of the 1990s, when the goal of the United States was to keep Russia down, to weaken it economically, control it politically, and if necessary, to break it up into constituent parts that would forever keep it weak and never able to rise up and challenge the United States in the way that the Soviet Union had done during the Cold War. These are people like Michael McFaul, Fiona Hill, Angela Stent, and others who, have written their PhD thesis on authoritarian rule and Vladimir Putin. These are people who supported Boris Yeltsin's government and are resentful that Putin emerged from the post-Yeltsin period to try and unify Russia and make Russia strong again, which he has done. Whether you like Putin or you dislike Putin, you have to acknowledge that he has taken Russia out of, the swamp that Boris Yeltsin had created in the post-Gorbachev, post-Perestroika era, and he has taken Russia up to be one of the strongest and most resilient economies. People talk about infrastructure. In the United States, of course, we have concerns about infrastructure. We have rail cars derailing, we have bridges collapsing, etc. People don't like to talk about the fact that Vladimir Putin has just succeeded in expanding the Russian subway around Moscow. And if you go in the subway, will put anything New York City has to shame instantly. The totality of the Russian subway. It's modern, it's clean, it's efficient, it's everything we would want our infrastructure to be, and everything we claim the Russian infrastructure can't be, because if he's a dictator ruling over this dysfunctional country, how could they possibly produce that? But the Russians produce a lot of good things. It's a nation that's on the rise. And I'm not saying that because I want to sing its praises. I'm saying it because that's real. You can't solve a problem unless you first accurately define the problem. Because any solution you come up to a problem that's not accurately defined isn't a solution at all. It's nothing. To discuss Russia as a problem, we have to describe it accurately. And it can't be described accurately if you're putting everything on the shoulders of Vladimir Putin and you're trying to describe him as this evil character, which, of course, all senior Americans doing, whether they're in the Pentagon or they're in the White House or they're in Congress. You will not see a single person say what I just said about the reality of Russia. Instead, Congress holds hearing after hearing where they bring in these Putin whisperers who say over and over again about how bad Russia is, how poorly it performs, how dysfunctional it is, and how dictatorial Vladimir Putin is. That's just not the truth.
Yeah. Putin and politicians. Yesterday, Senator Lindsey Graham called for the U.S. military to start shooting down Russian warplanes anytime they enter international waters. This is his reaction to the Russian fighter jet taking down the Reaper drone over the Black Sea. What kind of repercussions would there be for the United States if we start shooting down Russian warplanes?
Well, the potential for all-out war. I mean, Russia's not going to let that happen. They would challenge us militarily, and then we would end up in a force-on-force conflict that neither side can afford to back down from. So it turns into total war, and then that has the potential of turning into a nuclear exchange, and then this conversation is moot because we're going to be dead. That's what Lindsey Graham needs to understand, and that's what the people who listen to Lindsey Graham need to understand. He's a very dangerous man right now. I know he's a United States senator. I know he's allowed to speak his mind and, et cetera. But that doesn't mean that people who are listening to him should treat what he's saying as if it is the truth. He is speaking in a very dangerous manner. First of all, he said that he implied that Ronald Reagan would never allow something like this to happen. Well, with all due respect, Lindsey Graham, I was in the military as a Soviet expert during the Reagan administration, and we let it happen all the time because, the idea of flying provocative mission profiles with aircraft or with ships didn't begin today. And people should be under no, misconception here. What we did with the Reaper was a provocation. We took an intelligence collection platform, flew it in an area that the Russians know, that we know is very sensitive to Russia, right off the coast of the Crimea Peninsula, one of the most heavily militarized areas in Russia, during a time of war when the United States has a history of collecting intelligence, giving it to Ukrainians so they can target the Russians. So the fact that we're flying an intelligence collection profile in support of Ukraine along the Russian coast is in itself an act of war. This isn't a peaceful exercise. We are being provocative, deliberately so. Two, the Russians have created an exclusion zone and have announced that to the United States, saying that you cannot fly in this area because we have sensitive military activity taking place. That is required under international law. But what we're saying is that because Crimea is Ukrainian, not Russian, the Russians illegally occupied it, Russia has no ability to put an exclusion zone in on what is Ukrainian territory, so we disregarded it. So we sent a $32 million aircraft into this exclusion zone with a sensitive intelligence collection pod, collecting intelligence that when it's returned will be given to the Ukrainians to plan military operations against the Russians. And we're shocked that the Russians took the plane down. So Lindsey Graham is wrong. Marco Rubio, who also came out and spoke about this, is wrong. This wasn't the United States innocently trying to exercise freedom of navigation. This was the United States carrying out a purposefully provocative operation that makes the United States an active participant in an ongoing conflict. And so if you see it in that perspective, you realize what we did was horribly irresponsible. And now Lindsey Graham is talking about escalation by bringing in, manned fighter aircraft in a way that's designed to create a force-on-force incident with the United States and Russia. This is bad policy. Fortunately, I don't see the Pentagon or the White House going down this path because there are saner minds out there than Lindsey Graham or Marco Rubio.
Okay, so they're going to be ignored.